Hey, it is awesome. It's Christmas time. It's 9 days till Christmas. It's one gathering left after today where we have our Christmas parties, and then we enter our year of thankfulness, which is going to be awesome as a community. I'm so excited to enter the year of thankfulness, and I want to encourage every person, even like right now, don't wait for our first series back where we talk about it, but think about January 1st. What would it look like in your life to be more thankful? Does it look like getting out your phone each day and opening up the Notes app and just writing 5 things that you're thankful for every morning and just taking 1 minute to do that? I promise you, just the simple things like practicing thankfulness in ways that you can sustain will change the whole way that you experience your life. So I really want to encourage you to pick one habit in your life that you can do for the month of January, from January 1st, to practice thankfulness. Maybe it's to write a card each day. Maybe it's to send one person a text just to say how much you're thankful for them. I don't know what it is, but you choose something that you feel like, man, this excites me and I can do that because it's the year of thankfulness, which is going to be awesome. We announced Curate Auckland 2 weeks ago, which has been awesome, and so many exciting things have taken place. So we're excited to start building in Auckland next year, which is really, really cool. And just so many great things going on. I just want to give everybody in every location a heads up, because I was sitting in our team meeting this morning and just super grateful for all of our teams. And in a moment, we'll take a moment to just thank all of our teams everywhere. But all through Curate, this place exists mainly because of 2 groups of people. The people who serve and the people who give are the people who sustain the life of this place. And without those 2 groups of people, everyone else couldn't just turn up and, experience the community the way it is. And this morning, I was freshly grateful for all of our teams, as we had one of our biggest teams of the year serving this morning here in the 9 o'clock in the Mount. But I as well just thought, man, how amazing is it, all the people who faithfully give all during the year, and nobody ever knows who they are or knows how much they give or anything like that. But without them, we wouldn't have a buildings to be in. We wouldn't have been able to do gift of groceries and help 1,200 people last week. We wouldn't have been able to do so many of the different things that make Curate what it is. And so I just wanted to, at the end of the year, I guess, take a moment to say thank you so much for all of the people who give to Curate, and thank you for all the people who will continue to give through January, even though we're not operating. And we'll see you all back on January 13th after our Christmas parties next week, obviously, which will be awesome. Are you guys ready for the gift? Great. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the gift of Jesus. Thank you for the gift of this season. I know that in the hurriness and in the rush and in the presents and the parties, and it can be easy to forget what the point of this season is, which is to celebrate that you came 2,000 years ago and you put on humanity. And God, would what you did 2,000 years ago, would it become fresh again to us today? Would you come to us afresh in this season? Would we experience you afresh in this season? This morning, God, would you speak to us in Jesus' name? Everybody said, amen, amen. Well, we went for a run the other day, which, if you know me, that's quite a rare occurrence. I'm not like anti-exercise, but I am anti-running. I feel like it's monotonous, boring, and has no point. I own a car. I could drive somewhere. And so, but I went for a run, and I was running, and, God bless all the runners out there, but I was running, and I noticed after about the first few 100 meters, and maybe for you it might be after the first few Ks, or maybe it might be the first few meters, but after the first few 100 meters, I noticed that something started to happen in my mind. Something started to happen that doesn't happen when I walk, it only happens when I run. Is like this voice going, you've run far enough. Like, I think my heart rate was, just starting to get above resting, and I think I'd done that initial dash that you don't really think about. And then at that point, it's just, you've run far enough. Nobody's watching you. Nobody cares. Nobody's counting. There's nobody measuring. There's nothing like that going on. Just stop. Just why are you running anyway? Who are you running from? Where are you running to? Why are you in a hurry? And the voice kept going, and then another voice comes in. It's like, no, you need to run. You need to get the blood flowing. You got a sore back. Get some blood flowing through your muscles. You know, it's the only point I'm running is because I'm so sore that I have no other option. And so I'm doing this thing, and I just notice how the voices seem to come and to go over the course of a run. I'm not running very far, but over that time, it's like I walk the exact way that I ran that day, and I've never experienced those voices when I walk. But when I was running, for some reason, the voices are there, like, stop. You've had enough. And then another voice will be like, no, just go to the next corner, just the next lamppost. You know, I don't know if I'm the only, but there's this these voices came that don't come when I was walking. And I started to think, like, what is this? And I realized that there's something that's true of all of us in life, that the more intense something is, the more ramped up the pressure is, the more important or significant something is, the higher role voices play in our lives. I don't know if you've noticed that. Walking, there's not a lot at stake. There's not a lot of pressure on me. I can do that with ease. And so there's no voices. But the moment where I'm trying to push myself and do something a little bit more, it's like voices begin to play a bigger part. And I don't know if you've noticed that. It's true in every area of life. When you're smooth sailing and you're within your comfort zone and you're not pushing any boundaries and you're not trying to do anything, you're not wanting to change, you're not wanting anything more, probably the voices don't play a big role. But the moment you're trying to, push forward, the moment you're trying to work on your marriage, the moment you're trying to make a difference, the moment you're trying to grow spiritually, the moment you're trying to ramp up the intensity in any way, it's like all of a sudden voices begin to play a bigger role in our lives. And I think if you're here today in any one of our rooms, this would be true of your life, because just by the fact that you're here says something about the spiritual journey that you're on. And we're all in different stages, but even just being committed to a spiritual journey and seeking and wondering and asking questions is like the intensity of our life being ramped up. And we have a real resistance to that life. And so because of that, voices ramp up. Voices that try to pull us back to our old ways, voices that try to keep us suppressed, voices that try to discourage us, voices that want to make us our worst selves, all of those things. And I just want to take a moment this morning to talk about the gift of Jesus' voice. Because I think one of the most profound things about Christmas is that Jesus would become incarnate. He would become Emmanuel. He would become God with us. Up until this point in human history, we had only ever heard God's voice secondhand. So we had only ever heard what maybe God thinks through somebody else and through prophets and through religious leaders and through different things. But when Jesus was born, what it allowed us to do, it allowed humanity to lean in and go, if God's going to speak to us firsthand, what type of things would he say? Because I think one of the most surprising things as the voices ramp up in our lives is what we think is the voice of God in our lives. And I think one of the greatest barriers to people really leaning into everything God has for them in their life is what they think he sounds like. And what they think he's saying to them. And most of the time, what we think is what God's saying, and what we think is what God would think of a certain thing going on in our life is actually not at all the type of thing God would say. And the voices we suppose to have been God, if we actually sort of wrap off the layers a little bit, we realize are not God at all. I've been thinking about this metaphor because I was inspired by, I've been reading a lot of an author, Brené Brown, lately, just an amazing author, just some fantastic thoughts. And she gave me this picture that life is like an arena. I don't know if you've ever been to a game at a stadium, but I remember the first time my dad ever took me to a game in a stadium, it was a cricket game, and it was in the Basin Reserve, and we sat on the banks of the Basin Reserve, which is like, this is in like the early 90s, it was a very rowdy place. And I remember that the Black Caps were playing Australia, and I have never heard so much profanity in my life as I did on I remember just as a young kid, just like eyes wide open to everything that's going on the banks of the Basin Reserve. And because it's interesting when there's a few people playing, there's 22 people, and there's not actually 22 people ever in the middle. There's only ever 13 people ever in the middle of a cricket pitch, but there's 13 people in there. But it's amazing how the 10,000 spectators, they all have a voice that they shout into the arena for the people actually in the game. And I don't, you've been to a rugby game, you've been anything. In the arena, there is no lack of opinion. In the arena, there's no lack of criticism. There's no person holding back, tell us what you truly think as you yell at the referee, there's no withholding from the stands of the fans or the critics, right? And in a cricket game, they're letting each player individually know by name exactly what they think of them. When one comes close, a lot of opinions are shared. And I thought, man, that is exactly what life's like. That when we're on a spiritual journey, it's like we step into an arena, into a battle zone, into a confrontation, into something where we're trying to advance, and it's like the stands all of a sudden fill up with voices. And I love what Brene Brown says, is like there's certain life season ticket holders that have tickets and have seats in the arena of our lives. She's like, she talks about how for every person, there's always 2 seats reserved for shame. And from those 2 seats, you will always hear in your life, you're not good enough. Who do you think you are? You're not good enough. Who do you think you are? They're the voices of shame that would call you to be less. And right next to them, they've also bought lifetime season passes. There would be the voices of scarcity and comparison. Scarcity would yell to you, you're going to come up short. You're not going to have what it takes. It's not going to work out. And comparison would say, why isn't it happening like it's happening for XYZ? Why aren't you more like? And essentially all of these voices, they call to our worst selves. They call to our darkest selves. They call to our weakest selves. They never call to our best selves. And when we step into the arena of advancement in our lives, what happens is the voices begin to get louder and there becomes more and more of them. And so in that environment, it is more important than ever to know the sound of your Father in heaven. It's important to know the sound of your Father in heaven, and we can know the sound of our Father in heaven through the sound of Jesus. Because Jesus says, I only do what my Father does, and I only say what my Father says. And so for the first time ever in human history, 2,000 years ago, when Jesus is born as a little baby, and as he grows, and as his words are recorded in the red letters of our Bible, we discover the true gift, the red letter words. The gift, the red letter words, not the words secondhand through a prophet, not the words secondhand through a religious leader, not the supposings of what God might say about a similar circumstance, but the actual words of Jesus, that he would speak to the hurting, to the broken, to the desperate, to the hungry. And I just love reading some of those stories going, that's what Jesus would say? Man, I don't know what I'm thinking Jesus is saying, but here's some of my favorites, if we could just do this for a few minutes. Here's some of my favorites. John chapter 8, there is a woman caught in adultery. Now, you can just imagine what a woman caught in adultery looks like for a moment. It's a very vulnerable position to be caught in adultery. And then that woman is not just caught in adultery, she's dragged out in judgment, not the man, just the woman's dragged out in judgment and laid before a whole bunch of men after being caught in adultery. Like you've got vulnerability and exposure and shame 100-fold. The reality is she has sinned, she has broken God's commands, she has done what she shouldn't have been doing, but the whole rest of it has lumped shame upon shame. And so here she is, and then they bring Jesus before her. So they think they understand God's word and God's perspective. And so they say, God, we think that what you say is in this situation, this person should be stoned to death. That is the punishment for adultery in that society at that time. And so Jesus is caught in a conundrum because that is the law, but that's not necessarily what he would want to speak into that situation. And so he's caught between the law and his compassion. The law and his perspective. And so it says that he writes in the ground, and we could imagine what perhaps he writes. But it says that he stands up, and to all of those in judgment trying to trap Jesus and trying to punish this woman, he says, he who is without sin, why don't you go ahead and throw the first rock at her? Now, it doesn't take the most aware person to realize that's probably not me. And so, one by one, it says, starting from the oldest to the youngest, they began to drop their rocks and walk away. And then in John chapter 8, verse 22, Jesus kneels down to the woman and said, where are your accusers? And she says, they are all gone. And he says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. I don't know where you're at in life. I don't know what things that if you were dragged out into the open this week from the last week or month and you were to be accused, and we could all have stuff because we're all humans. And I don't know what's been replaying in your head over the last week about the mistakes that you know you've made. And I don't know what voices have risen up in accusation and judgment saying that you're not good enough, you'll never change, you need to be embarrassed of this, who are you to call yourself a Christian, who are you to even be here today? I don't know what voices have risen up in your life over the last week or month, but I know we need to hear the sound of Jesus, who would say, I don't accuse you, just go forth and sin no more. The sound of the one who would call you to your highest self and your best self, not your worst self, and keep you in the dirt and in the shame. And I know some people need to hear that this morning in every location. That if Jesus was to speak to your mistakes this week, he wouldn't be speaking accusation. He'd be speaking a future that doesn't include those mistakes. And every time you replay them and hold on to them, you're letting the other voices cheer you into a direction that Jesus isn't cheering you on into. Man, we could think of so many stories. I think of the story of Peter, and he let Jesus down. He completely let Jesus down. He was supposed to be Jesus' main guy. Jesus had said to him, on you, I'm going to birth the church. You're like the leader of these band of weird people that I've gathered around me that are going to birth the church. But you're like the leader, Peter. You are the rock, and upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. Then Jesus, in his hour of need, when he's getting hung on the cross, and when he's getting accused, and when Peter is nowhere to be found. And he's nowhere to be found because a few people asked him if he knew Jesus. And after following him for 3.5 years, living with him every day, having given up everything to follow him, in Jesus' most vulnerable hour, Peter was nowhere to be found. Because when push came to shove, Peter denied that he knew Jesus because he was afraid of what that might have meant for his own life. Jesus dies. He doesn't get a chance to see Jesus again until the story's retold in John chapter 21. And you imagine if you're Peter, you're feeling pretty bad about what happened. You're thinking that probably disqualifies you from the future God spoke over your life on a better day. See, God had spoken a purpose. God had spoken a future like he's spoken over so many of our lives. He had spoken something of what he wants to do and how he wants to use Peter. He's spoken it over you. But then there's been a season or a set of circumstances where you know you haven't done what you should have done, and that's exactly where Peter's at. And you can imagine when he's coming before Jesus, he's probably just happy if him and Jesus can be good. He's probably recognizing that the future and the purpose, that's probably a write-off now. And so he comes to reconcile with Jesus, and he's probably expecting maybe just to be allowed back in, but hey, we're going to have to give that role to somebody else now. But instead, Jesus asks him a set of questions, which is really one question 3 times. And he says, do you love me, Peter? And Peter says, you know that I love you. He says, well, feed my sheep. And this same conversation repeats 3 times, and it's a conversation of, he had denied him 3 times, and it was a reconciliation of 3 times. And I love what Jesus speaks when he says, well, feed my sheep. He's reconfirming that even though you've made mistakes, the purpose is still on the table. That was not conditional of you getting everything perfect. It was conditional of you staying in relationship with me. And here you are, you've come back to reconcile and you still love me, so let's go forward together. Man, we could think of so many stories, like the leper who is an outcast and is separated from society, and all the leper ever hears is, stay away, you don't belong with us. Lepers with skin disease had to live outside of the cities because they're contagious, and because of that, they also had to stay at any point in time about 50 steps away from any other person. So they lived alone and isolated like people feel here today. Feeling like they don't deserve community, feeling like because of something that's happened, they're the odd ones out. They're not deserving of love. They're not deserving of acceptance. They're not deserving. Everybody else is deserving, but I'm so broken, I'm not deserving. And it tells us in Mark chapter 5, that a leper broke all of those social norms and came before Jesus and said, if you're willing, would you reach out your hand and heal me? And you need to understand that for this leper, this may have been the first time the leper has ever been touched in his life by another human being. And Jesus says, his words are, I am willing. And it says he touched him and he was healed. And maybe today, the voice you need to hear from Jesus is that he is willing. And even though you feel far away, he longs to bring you in close. You're not the odd one out. Last story, I think, is in Mark chapter 8. And it tells us of a pastor, if you would, and his daughter. He's waiting on Jesus to come and heal the daughter, but Jesus takes too long because he's busy healing somebody else. And the daughter dies. And it says by the time Jesus arrives at Jairus' house, that it says that the daughter has passed away, and there's weeping and there's mourning. It's essentially a pre-funeral procession is happening. And it tells us that Jesus comes into the house and says, why is everybody crying and mourning? She's just asleep. And it says that they laughed at him. They laughed at him. It says that he went up into the room and he healed her. He said, get up. And she got up and she was alive, and they got her to eat something. And it's just an amazing and a beautiful story. But I was thinking about this because how many of us have children or people that are important to us that people say situations are hopeless. Because as Jesus arrives at the house, they say, there's no point in coming here now. She's already dead. Like all hope is lost, all hope is gone. There's nothing Jesus could ever do with this situation. There's nothing Jesus could ever do with this child. There's nothing Jesus could ever do with this marriage. There's nothing Jesus could ever do with this business. There's nothing Jesus could ever do with this circumstance. All hope is lost. So there's weeping and there's mourning, and Jesus says, no, it's not dead. It's just asleep. And he comes in and he touches. And what looked hopeless, Jesus becomes the voice of hope in. And I just want us, as we head into the break, and even though the intensity of our lives starts to simmer down, what happens sometimes is in the quietness, the voices come to rise up. And if we're not prepared in those times, then those voices become filled with despair, with shame, with guilt, with you're not good enough, with your purpose is gone, there's too much water under the bridge, you need to give up on that. And if we're not prepared, those voices begin to take over our minds, and they will hijack our future. But the gift of Christmas, one of the many, is that we don't have to wonder what Jesus would say. We know. It's been written down for us. We know what he would say in our biggest mistakes. He would say, I do not accuse you. Let's just go forward together. We know what he would say when we've walked away from what we knew was true. He would say, that's fine. Just come back into the fold and start feeding my sheep. We know what he would say when all of our circumstances look hopeless. He would be the bringer of a voice of hope into those circumstances. We know what he would say when we feel lonely. He would say that we're accepted. I just love when Jesus would hang on the cross and everybody's accusing him and ridiculing him, as it's probably requiring every bit of restraint in him to say, do you not realize who I am and what I am doing? And you're saying I'm weak for being up here and that I need to show my strength. But in this what looks like weakness, I am showing my strength. But his voice wouldn't be some like, so frustrated with humanity. His voice wouldn't be, if only you knew. His voice would just be the soft prayer to the Father. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Man, isn't his voice just the most healing thing? In youth group, we used to play this game. It was, we'd get like 20 people. One person would leave the room. That person represents you in the story. One person, when that person leaves the room, would be nominated as God. It's an awesome position. Everybody else would be the world, the devil, the voices, the whatever. Now the person would be invited back into the room, and it was God's job to try and lead this person to whatever part of the house they were supposed to be led to. But they were never allowed to say that they were God. And so with 20 people shouting in their ear, trying to say, come this way, or distract, or just make noise so that they couldn't hear the God among the group, God would have quite a challenge to somehow break through. But I noticed something every single time as we played this game. The person who was God realized everybody else is shouting. Perhaps I have to pick a different pitch and a different tone if I'm going to stand out amongst the voices. And normally the person who was God, the people that were good at it, would choose a whisper rather than a yell. And would try and get the whisper close enough to the person's ear that they would be able to tune into it and somehow block out the rest of the voices and just follow that one. In life, it's exactly like that game. There's such loud voices. Somebody said to me this week in a phone call, they said, I live in such a busy and noisy world, I can't even hear the voice of God. Isn't that so true? So as we slow down, would we listen for the whisper? And would we let the whisper define how we see ourselves and how we see our world? And we follow that through, because we don't have to wonder what God sounds like anymore. We know.